Welcome to the world of sci-fi story, and don't forget to like and subscribe the channel. Alien girl falls under the spell of human music. She can't resist. The song that changed everything. The neon lights of Nova Prime City glowed like a million stars reflecting off the sleek glass-covered streets. Hover cars hummed softly as they passed, and the air smelled of electric rain. The city was alive, filled with humans and aliens moving together in a delicate dance of coexistence in the middle of this futuristic world. Inside a crowded music hall, Elias Carter stood on stage, his fingers gently resting on the strings of his old acoustic guitar. The crowd murmured in anticipation, waiting for the first note. Among them, standing stiffly near the back, was Zira, an alien girl from the Velmari race. Her glowing silver eyes scanned the room, but her heart, if she could call it that, was frozen in her chest. She had never been in a place like this. She had never seen humans act this way. Most of all, she had never heard human music before. Her people did not understand music. They only knew patterns, calculations, and perfect silence. The moment Elias strummed the first chord, Zira felt something strange inside her. It was a slow, creeping warmth that moved through her limbs. Her fingers trembled, and she had to grab the back of a chair to steady herself. Then Elias began to sing. His voice was deep, raw, and filled with emotion. The melody floated through the air, wrapping around Sarah like a soft, invisible thread. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Something inside her shifted for the first time in her life. She felt something real. The song spoke of loneliness, of wandering the universe without knowing where you belong. It was about dreams and hope, about losing everything but still finding beauty in the stars. Zira's mind struggled to process it. Emotions were not natural for her people. They believed in logic, in fact in control. But this music, this was chaos, and yet it was the most beautiful thing she had ever experienced. Her body reacted before her mind could stop it. Her heartbeat quickened, her breathing became uneven, and she stepped forward without realizing it. The closer she got to the stage, the louder the music became, the stronger the feeling inside her grew. The song was inside her now. It was changing her. She could feel it moving through her body like a storm, unlocking something that had always been buried deep within her. Her hands shook, her eyes burned. She wanted to cry, though she didn't even know what tears were supposed to feel like. The humans around her swayed to the music, their faces showing joy, sadness, longing. How could they live with this much feeling every day? Elias sang the last note, and the room fell silent for a moment. Zira thought her heart had stopped. Then the crowd roared, clapping and cheering. Elias smiled, his dark eyes scanning the faces in front of him. His gaze swept over the crowd, and for just a second his eyes locked onto Zira. She froze. Did he know? Could he see what the music had done to her? Her breath hitched, and she turned on her heel, rushing toward the exit. She needed air. She needed space. The cold night hit her like a wave as she stepped out into the streets. Her hands still trembled. She felt like she was losing control for the first time in her life. She was afraid, because deep inside her something whispered, "You will never be the same again." And she knew it was true. The forbidden sound. Zira's hands still trembled as she walked through the cold streets of Nova Prime City. The echoes of the human song had not faded from her mind. The sound lingered, wrapping around her thoughts like invisible strings, pulling her forward. She should have gone home. She should have reported this strange experience to the Velmari High Council. Let them erase this thing inside her before it grew worse. But she couldn't. Instead, her feet carried her through the dimly lit alleys, the distant hum of neon signs reflecting in the rain puddles at her feet. The music had changed something in her. She felt emotion. She had no words for an ache in her chest that refused to fade. She needed to hear more. Her people had always warned about human influence. The Velmari were a race of perfection, masters of logic and order. They controlled their emotions with precision, believing feelings to be chaos, weakness, a disease. But now Zira understood something they didn't. Emotion was not weakness, it was power, and that power was pulling her toward Elias Carter, the hidden listener. Elias's small studio was tucked away in a quiet corner of the city, a simple room filled with instruments, wires, and old records stacked in chaotic piles. Through the half-open door, Zira could hear music. She hesitated, standing in the shadows. Elias sat on a stool, lost in his world, plucking at his guitar. His eyes were half-closed fingers moving effortlessly over the strings. The sound was softer. This time slower. It filled the space with warmth, with longing. Zura's fingers gripped the cold metal frame of the door. She didn't want to interrupt, she only wanted to listen, but something inside her was changing too fast. The music swirled around her, stirring her mind. Her legs felt weak. She barely noticed her own breathing growing heavier, her fingers twitching as if aching to touch something. She let out a small, sharp gasp. Elias stopped playing. His head turned toward the door. For a moment there was only silence. Then in a calm voice, he said, "You can come in." A dangerous connection. Zura's body froze. She should have run. She should have disappeared into the night, but her feet refused to move. Slowly she stepped into the room, her glowing silver eyes flickering as they adjusted to the dim light. Elias watched her carefully, his fingers still resting on the guitar strings. "You were at the concert," he said, tilting his head slightly. "You stood out." Zura's throat felt dry. Her voice cracked. Speaking felt wrong in this moment. Words were not enough. Elias didn't seem surprised by her hesitation. He strummed a few notes on his guitar, filling the silence between them. "You like music," he said simply. Zura's breath hitched. The way he said it, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, made her chest tighten. She should deny it, she should walk away, but instead she whispered, "What is it?" Elias raised an eyebrow. "Music." She nodded. He let out a small, amused breath and set his guitar down. "It's a way of feeling." His voice softened, its emotion turned into sound. "It connects people, it tells stories." Zura's fingers clenched into fists. Feeling, connection, stories. These were things the Velmeri feared, things she had never understood until now, and she wanted more. "I need to hear it again," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias studied her carefully. He could see the desperation in her expression, the way her body trembled slightly as if caught between two worlds. Without another word, he picked up his guitar and began to play the sound that cannot be forgotten. The moment the first note filled the air, Zura felt it rush through her like a storm. The sound wrapped around her, lifted her, broke her apart, and put her back together. She closed her eyes, her body swaying slightly, her heart pounding in time with the rhythm. And then something terrifying happened. She hummed along. It was small, barely a whisper, but Elias heard it, his fingers stilled on the strings, his eyes widening slightly. Zura snapped, her mouth shut, stepping back, her chest heaved. What had she just done? Velmeri did not sing. They did not hum. Their voices were meant for logic, for data, for commands. But she had done it instinctively. Elias smiled, a spark of understanding in his expression. "I think," he said slowly, "you were starting to feel the music." Zura's stomach twisted. "Feel that word again. This is dangerous." She knew it, and she knew it was too late to stop. Watch from the shadows outside the studio, hidden in the dark alleys of Nova Prime City. A pair of cold, calculating eyes watched a figure in a long metallic coat, raised a communicator to their lips, speaking in a low, steady voice. "We have found her. She is corrupted by the human sound." A pause. Then the answer came, "Bring her back no matter what." Chased by silence, the night air of Nova Prime City hummed with the sound of hover cars gliding through the neon-blitzed sky. Street lights flickered in electric blue, casting long shadows between towering skyscrapers. The city was alive, pulsing with noise, but for Zura, standing frozen outside Elias's studio, everything had gone silent. Her breath came in short, uneven gasps, her chest ached, not from exhaustion, but from something far worse. Fear. She had sung not much, just a hum. Simple sound, but it had come from her. It had risen from her chest, unbidden. Unexpected, impossible. Velmeri did not sing. They did not make music. They did not allow themselves to be changed. And yet she had changed. Zura pressed a shaking hand to her temple, her mind racing. "What is happening to me?" Inside the studio, Elias was still playing, lost in his world of melodies, unaware that Zura had stepped outside. But she couldn't stay, not now, not when she felt the walls of her reality cracking around her. She turned sharply and disappeared into the dark streets. She needed time. She needed answers. She needed to understand why the music refused to leave her mind. A world that does not forget. The streets of Nova Prime felt colder than before. Zura pulled the hood of her cloak over her head, Moving quickly between alleyways, avoiding the main roads, her mind was a storm of thoughts. Maybe if she went back to the Velmary High Council they could fix this. Maybe they could make it stop. No, the thought of losing the music, of never hearing it again, sent a shiver down her spine. She didn't want it to stop. And that was the most terrifying part. A sudden click echoed behind her, a mechanical sound, sharp, precise, a sound she recognized. Zur stopped walking slowly. She turned her head. At the end of the alley stood a Velmary hunter, tall, wrapped in a silver-trimmed coat. His glowing eyes locked onto her. With calculating precision, the weapon on his wrist hummed softly, a containment device, designed not to kill but to capture Zura. He spoke in the Velm tongue, his voice calm, unwavering. "Come with me now." Zura's stomach twisted. They had found her so quickly. Had they been following her all this time? Had they already known? She did not answer. She turned and ran. "The chase begins." The hunter reacted instantly. A blue light flared from his wrist as he fired. Zur barely managed to dodge, rolling to the side as a glowing net slammed into the ground where she had stood a second ago. It sizzled against the pavement, dissolving into nothing. She pushed herself up and sprinted. The city blurred past her as she weaved through the maze of alleys, her heart hammering against her ribs, her cloak whipped behind her, her boots pounding against the ground. The hunter followed, moving with terrifying speed, his voice crackling through a hidden communicator. Targeted his fleeing. "Send reinforcements." Zur's pulse spiked. "More were coming. I have to lose him." She darted into a side street, leaped over a stack of metal crates, and cut through a small marketplace. Vanguard shouted in protest as she knocked over a display of glowing fruit, but she didn't stop. The music was still in her mind, the echoes of the Ilias's song pushing her forward. Then a second hunter stepped into her path. She skidded to a halt. The trap was closing. A desperate escape. The second hunter raised his wrist, another net device glowing, ready to fire. Zura's instincts screamed in a desperate move. She grabbed a discarded metal pole from the ground and swung it at the first hunter. Just as he lunged at her, the impact was enough to knock him off balance, giving her the split second she needed to run again. She twisted her body, jumped onto a low rooftop, and pulled herself up just as the second hunter fired. The net hit the wall below her, fizzling against the bricks. Zura didn't stop. She ran across the rooftops, her breath coming in sharp gas. Her limbs burned, her lungs etched. But she couldn't let them take her. Not now, not when she had felt music, not when she had felt alive for the first time. The hunters chased her, but she had one advantage. They didn't know the city as well as she did. She took every turn, every hidden path, using the chaos of Nova Prime's bright, crowded streets to disappear into the sea of life below. By the time she finally stopped hiding in the shadows of an old abandoned building, she could no longer hear them. She had escaped. But for how long? Elias's decision. Far away back in the studio, Elias tapped his fingers against his guitar, frowning. Something felt off. Zura had been acting strange. More than just curious, she had looked afraid. And now she was gone. He didn't know much about her, didn't even know if she had a home here in Nova Prime. But something told him that if he let this go, he would regret it. He picked up his guitar case and slung it over his shoulder. He was going to find her. The hunt is not over. Somewhere in the city, the Velmary hunters regrouped. One of them activated a small hovering drone, its red lights scanning the skyline. "She won't get far," the leader said. The drone flickered, locking onto something, a faint energy signature, a trace of human music. The hunter's lips curled into a cold smile. "We have her." The last performance. The rain poured over Nova Prime City, streaking down the neon signs and turning the streets into rivers of electric blue and red. The city pulsed with life, but Zura felt like a ghost moving through it. She kept to the shadows, her hood pulled low over her silver eyes, her breath shallow. She was being hunted. She could still hear the music in her mind. Elias's song, it haunted her, filled the empty spaces inside her chest, where logic and control used to live. She had been different before she heard it. Now she could never go back. The Velmary would never let her go. Her heart pounded as she pressed herself against a cold steel wall in a dark alley, listening. Somewhere nearby, the hunters were searching for her. Their footsteps echoed against the wet pavement. Their voices were low, controlled, precise. Zura's fingers curled into fists. They will erase everything, the music, the emotions, the new version of herself. They would take it all away. She would not let that happen. She had to find Elias. He was the only human who could help her. Elias's decision. Elias stood outside his studio, scanning the dark streets. He hadn't seen Zira since the night she had listened to his music and run away. He didn't know why he cared so much. He barely knew her, but something about her, the way she had looked at him like he had changed her world, wouldn't let him forget. Then he saw them, 3 figures in long metallic coats moving together, scanning the streets. They weren't from Nova Prime, and they were definitely looking for someone. Elias's gut twisted. Zira. He turned back into his studio, grabbed his guitar case, and slung it over his shoulder. If she was in trouble, he wasn't about to let them take her. The moment they found her, Zira barely had time to react. A metal device whizzed through the air and latched onto her wrist. A sharp jolt of electricity shot through her body, locking her muscles in place. She fell to her knees, gasping. From the shadows, the Velmary hunter stepped forward. "You've caused enough trouble," he said, his voice cold. Zira struggled against the device, but it was designed to paralyze. She could barely move. Behind him, 2 more hunters appeared, their expressions unreadable. "It's time to come home, Zira," one of them said. Her breath came fast and shallow. No, she couldn't go back, but she had no strength left to fight. Then, out of the darkness, she heard it, a single note, soft, gentle, a guitar. The hunters paused, their glowing silver eyes flickering with confusion. Then came another note, and another. The melody was slow, hypnotic, a song of sorrow and defiance. The hunters turned toward the source of the sound. Elias. He stood at the entrance of the alley, his fingers moving across the strings of his guitar. His expression was calm, but his eyes burned with understanding. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew music had power over Zuta, and maybe, just maybe, it had power over them too. The battle of sound. The hunters hesitated, their rigid control faltering. The music washed over them, something foreign, something wrong, something dangerous for the first time in their lives. Then he grinned. "You," he said, "have one hell of a voice." Erasing the melody, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a cold mist that clung to the streets of Nova Prime City like a lingering ghost. Lights flickered in the distance, and the neon glow of the skyline reflected off the damp pavement. But for Zira and Elias, there was no time to stop and admire the city they were running. Elias's boots pounded against the ground, his breath coming in quick bursts. He glanced over his shoulder at Zira, who moved with surprising speed, her silver eyes flickering with determination. The Velmary hunters had fled, but they wouldn't stay away for long. Zira knew this, and she knew what was coming next would be far worse. "The High Council won't stop," she said, her voice tense. "They won't let this go." Elias tightened his grip on the guitar case, slung across his back. "Then what do we do?" Zira hesitated. "There was only one option. We have to leave the city." Elias slowed slightly. "Leave?" Zira nodded. "There's nowhere safe here. If they catch me, they'll erase everything." Elias didn't like the sound of that. "Erasers?" Swallowed. "They have ways of removing things from our minds. If they take me back to Velmary Prime, fatal." She cut herself off. She couldn't even say it. But Elias understood. It wouldn't just erase her memories of music, they would erase the part of her that had changed, and that was unforgivable. "All right," he said, adjusting the strap of his case. "Then let's go." Zira looked at him, surprised. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do," Elias interrupted. "I got you into this mess. I'm not letting you face it alone." For a second she didn't know what to say. Then, without another word, she nodded. They ran, captured in silence. They never made it out of the city. They had barely reached the edge of the lower districts when the world around them shifted. A pulse of blue energy rippled through the air. Zira barely had time to react before her limbs went rigid. Elias stumbled, his vision blurring. It felt like being pulled into a vacuum, the sound around them disappearing into a deafening silence. Zira's breath caught in her throat. "No, not now, not like this." She tried to resist, tried to move, but the energy field was too strong. A dark figure stepped into view, tall, cloaked in silver robes, eyes glowing like twin moons. "A Velmary elder. You've gone too far, Zira," the elder said, his voice smooth, untouched by emotion. "We gave you time to correct this mistake. You refused." Zira's heart pounded. She struggled against the invisible force, but it was useless. Elias growled, "Let her go." The elder's gaze flicked to him, as if just noticing his existence. "You are irrelevant." He lifted a hand, and Elias's body collapsed to the ground, the energy drained from his limbs. He fought to stay conscious, his head spinning. "Zira," screamed the elder, turned his attention back to her. "You were our brightest mind." He said almost with regret. No, that was impossible. The Velmeri didn't feel regret, and now neither would she. The last thing Zira saw was a cold flash of blue light, then darkness. A mind without music. Zira woke up in a sterile white room. The walls pulsed softly, shifting with a faint blue glow. There were no doors, no windows, no sound. She sat up sharply, her heart racing. Something was wrong. The panic came suddenly, gripping her like a vice. Why couldn't she hear it? The music, it was gone. She clutched her head, squeezing her eyes shut. It had been there before, the echoes of Elias's song, the melody that had changed her life. But now there was nothing, just emptiness. Her breathing grew ragged. No, this wasn't real. She tried to hum. Nothing. She tried to remember the melody. Nothing. Her mind was a void, an empty space where the music used to live. And then she realized they had erased it. She pressed her hands against her temples, a scream rising in her throat. This wasn't just about taking away a memory. They had stolen a piece of her soul. Elias fights back. Elias woke up in chains. His wrists were bound in metal cuffs, his head pounding from the attack. The air was cold, sterile. He was in a Velm holding cell, and Zur was gone. He clenched his jaw. No, he wasn't letting this end here. A soft humming sound caught his attention. He turned his head and saw a small floating drone hovering outside the cell, scanning him. It spoke in a flat mechanical voice. "The human is awake." Elias rolled his eyes. "Yeah, no kidding." A metallic door hissed open, and a figure stepped in. Not a hunter, not a soldier, a Villeri scientist. She regarded him with a strange expression, one that wasn't entirely empty. "She wasn't like the others. You played music," she said. "That is why they consider you dangerous." Elias smirked. "Dan, right?" She hesitated. "What does it feel like?" Elias blinked. What? She tilted her head. "Music feeling. I do not understand it." Elias narrowed his eyes. Was she curious? Slowly he lifted his hand, showing her the metal cuffs binding his wrists. "You really want to understand?" he said. The scientist hesitated. Then, after a long moment, she reached out and pressed a small button on the cuffs. They unlocked. Elias didn't waste time. He stood up, rubbing his wrists, and slung his guitar over his shoulder. "Take me to Zur," he said. The scientist hesitated again. Then she nodded. The battle for memory. Zira sat in her silent prison, her body trembling. Then a sound, a small one, a single note. Her head snapped up. At first, she thought she was imagining it, but then she heard it again, a soft melody, and then a voice. Elias's voice was muffled, distant, but growing stronger. Something inside her stirred. The Velmeri had erased the music from her mind, but they hadn't erased her heart. The music was still there, buried, trapped, and Elias was bringing it back. Her fingers twitched, her lips parted, and then she sang the sound of rebellion. The walls of the Villeri facility hummed with artificial silence, a silence so deep it pressed against the soul like an unmovable weight. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was the absence of feeling. Zur sat on the floor of her sterile white prison, her knees pulled to her chest. The flickering blue light overhead pulsed in perfect rhythm, like a machine breathing. She had been here for hours or days. She couldn't tell anymore, because time didn't exist when you felt nothing. Her hands trembled slightly as she touched her throat. She had tried to hum, tried to remember the melody. Elias had played, the one that had changed her life. But the moment she reached for it, it slipped away like a dream, fading the second you wake. She was empty. The Velmeri had taken the music from her mind. They had scrubbed away the emotions tied to it, locked them behind a wall so thick she couldn't even remember what it had felt like to be free. She should have been grateful. This was what she had been raised to believe was right. But somewhere buried deep in the silent prison of her mind, something fought back, something refused to die. Elias's plan. Outside the containment cell, Elias Carter moved through the cold steel corridors of the Villeri facility, his guitar slung across his back. He had no weapons, no plan, no idea how he had gotten this far without being captured again. But he had one advantage: music. And now as he and the Velmary scientist who had freed him reached Zura's cell, he knew it was time to play the most important song of his life. "She won't respond to you," the scientist said, quietly glancing at the door's control panel. "Her mind has been purged." Elias scoffed. "You think a little brainwashing is going to stop her?" The scientist hesitated. "We did not erase her. We only sealed the memories away. She has to choose to break free." Elias's fingers curled around his guitar strap. "That's all I needed to hear." He pulled the instrument in front of him and strummed a single chord. The sound echoed through the silent corridor, vibrating against the walls like a ripple in still water inside the cell. Zura's head snapped up. Her chest tightened. What was that breaking the silence? Elias played another note, then another, a slow, steady rhythm. The song wasn't a battle cry. It wasn't loud or angry. It was gentle, a call, a memory knocking on the door of a locked mind. Zura pressed her hands against the cold floor. She could feel it. Something stirring inside her. Something she thought was gone. Her heart pounded against her ribs. Her throat felt tight. And then a single word rose in her mind. "Sing." She squeezed her eyes shut, her breath coming in short gasps. She wanted to, she needed to, but the wall was still there, thick and heavy, suffocating the part of her that asked to be free. Elias kept playing. The song grew stronger, louder, fuller. The scientist stepped back, her eyes wide, as if seeing something impossible. The Velmary were not meant to be moved by sound, but she felt it, and